many people here. I really didn't know what to expect. I hope there was enough food. It looks like there is, so make sure you grab something to eat before you get out of here. I think we're very fortunate to have a speaker here today that's going to enlighten us on a few things. But before we get started, I want to introduce Mr. Warren Nash. He's president of the Board of Works, former mayor. He's back in the back there. Well, Warren, thanks for coming. Dr. Herb Joshua here. He's president of redevelopment. He's on his way. We're going to keep moving. Both of those guys are really watching what's going on in New Albany with traffic, and we're really pleased that they're serving. Also, Pat McLaughlin is in the back there. He's president of City Council. Thanks for coming, Pat. I'll go ahead and get started. As some of you may be aware, we're building a couple of bridges around here. And some of them have tolls, but Sherman-Minton does not. We're not sure what that impact will be on the downtown traffic, but we are committed to be prepared. The Redevelopment Commission has already taken some steps to have that situation analyzed. Today we hear from an expert on city planning and traffic control, and specifically how we might make our city more friendly and healthy for the people who live here. We are committed to improving the quality of life for our residents, so today we'll see some strong ideas on how we maybe will make that happen. I want to thank the DNA for helping to get this going, and Stephanie Graff for getting the jump on it. But right now I'd like to introduce Mr. Joe LaRocca, and he's going to say a few words and we'll kick this off. Again, thank you all very much for coming.
I'm not sure how I got called upon to introduce our speaker other than I read the book. But I will tell you that on behalf of Development Albany, I do want to thank Mayor Jeff Gahan and the City of New Albany and his staff for putting this together. It's just an excellent turnout. As I mentioned, I read Jeff's book, and here in our region, obviously by the turnout today, this has become a very popular topic, how we can make our cities more walkable, accessible, bikeable, all those kind of good things. A couple years ago, I had the opportunity through the YMCA where I worked to hear Mark Fenton, who's very similar to Jeff Speck here. He's a nationally known city planner, health and planning, transportation consultant, that kind of thing. And we took a walking tour of a neighborhood in Washington, D.C. called DuPont Square. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but it's a very walkable community, a lot of activity going on, people biking to different things and renting a bike at one spot and parking at another, all that kind of good stuff. And it was just very people-friendly. And cars were still in place, but just very people-friendly. I got back and ran across Roger Baylor. I don't know if Roger's here today, but he had a book that he was kind of carrying as a Bible, Walkability City, and it piqued my interest, and went out and got the book and read it, and it even more piqued my interest. And I'm an avid walker, and I walk in my neighborhood in Jeffersonville, and then of course here with working at the Y downtown, it's very convenient for me to walk. But as I walk in not only my neighborhood, but also here, I kind of see firsthand the things I've not only heard from Mark Fenton, but then also read in the book that Jeff Speck wrote. So with that, I'm excited about his presentation today, because I hope that we walk away from this not only continuing the dialogue, but hopefully call to action to do some things in our community to make us more healthy. So with that, Mr. Speck.
Joe, am I projecting? Yes. Not too echoey, a little echoey. Love the crowd and the 20 or so people standing, but we have chairs. I don't need to sit while I talk. So we have 2 chairs here. I can switch to the, it sounds like the handheld was better than this.
Yeah.
I'm going to switch to the handheld.
These never really work. These never really work quite well.
Angry. 2 chairs. How's this? Yeah? 2 chairs here and a piano bench. Here. So, thank you, Joe. Kind introduction. Thank you, Mayor. This is a lot of fun for me. I should say every city looks its best in a light dusting of snow. And so maybe I'm getting the wrong impression, but I had heard good things in the past about New Albany. I'd never been here before. I had last been in Louisville. Actually, it's a funny story. 11 years before. And in 20 years of giving talks like this, I've only had one disturbing experience, which was the talk I gave 11 years ago in Louisville. Which was a smart, did anyone go to the University of Kentucky Smart Growth Conference that was in, I think, 2001? And I got there and my talk was prepared, and because of the folks who were funding this conference, it was about, the scientists, the 3 scientists who deny global warming, right? Well, there's like 3 experts who deny that highways cause sprawl, and deny that that the U.S. subsidized the sprawl experiment and stuff like that. And because of who funded that conference, I had to speak after one of those fellows. And so I get up on stage, and this guy has just spoken for an hour about how the highway systems didn't contribute to suburban sprawl, and all these things that I just knew were false. And I essentially canceled my whole talk and spent the hour rebutting the previous speaker. And the guy who brought me in was livid. I won't name him. But I emailed him 2 days ago and says, hey, I'm coming back to Kentucky. You want to come see me? Because I know that he didn't like me anymore. And he's out of town, but I think we're now friends again after this brief exchange. But anyway, I'm not in Kentucky. I'm in Indiana. I recognize that. I've actually done a fair amount of work in Indiana, mostly in Carmel, which is a suburb of Indianapolis. And so, how far is it from here to Indianapolis?
2 hours.
But in 1985 to 1987, I was an investment banker at the First Boston Corporation, and my principal client was the Indiana Housing Finance Authority. And I toured your whole state as I helped build sprawl with loans for single-family homes. In any case, I was coming out here anyway to keynote tonight at the Main Street Conference, which is in Frankfort, Kentucky. And I'm mentioning that because, well, one, it was just wonderfully fortuitous that John, raise your hand, John Rosenbarger, is that right? Who you should all know, who's probably the reason I'm here, called me and asked me to come out. And he said, can you come sometime in the next few months? I said, oh, I'll be there in 2 weeks. And we arranged this to happen. But also, I'm mentioning the thing tonight because it's not that far from here, right? I'm driving there when we're done, or being driven there. And I don't have time to do what I want to do here, which is what I do most places that I go. And I've been speaking about once a week somewhere on the globe, almost entirely in America, except for a brief visit to Australia, since my book came out, which was over a year ago. So almost a talk a week. And people ask me to come, and I say, okay, here's what I charge. And they say, And I say, but I don't, first of all, I don't, I want to put that to good use. I want to put all my travel to good use. If I'm coming all the way to your community, I don't want to just zip in, zip out. And unfortunately here I have to zip in, zip out because this was added quickly. But I like to give 2 talks. I give a keynote usually, after dinner. It's best like if it's at the dinner hour after people have had a couple drinks. That I call Why Walkability, or why you need to be a more walkable place. And that's a talk that is a harangue. I have no images, and I explain to people the very powerful, these are no longer planning arguments, these are economic arguments, epidemiological arguments, and environmental arguments, why we need to refocus ourselves in places, I say cities, but frankly, it can be a city, a town, or a village, but a place that's more walkable, as a place where we're relying on the automobile just to get around. And then I follow that up, typically with a 2-hour workshop, which is how to achieve it. And it's funny that that first talk, and if you can't come tonight, because I'm not going to give that first talk today. If you can't come tonight to Frankfurt, or if it's sold out or whatever, but I don't think it is, I have a TED Talk that's a 17-minute version of the harangue that I recommend that you see. But if any of you can come out to Frankfurt, it would be great, because I only have time to give you the second half. And what's funny is that you know, if you do a TED Talk, you read the comments, and you're egotistical. You read the comments to your TED Talk, and most of the comments are quite positive. But one of them was like, yeah, I've had it with the why. What about the how? I'm like, that's my other talk. Which is, since I only have limited time here, I'm going to focus on the how. So I took some time, a little time on Google. I haven't been here before, but I took some time on Google Earth, and I looked around your city, and I have some illustrations from your city to help with this talk. But understand that this is essentially a best practices discussion of, frankly, best and worst practices that I've come to know around the country for making places more walkable and more livable, and that's what I want to share with you. So let's turn down the lights in front, and again, it's a 2-hour talk, so I hope you guys have until 2:30. Just kidding, but I'm gonna rush through it. And typically, when it's a 2-hour talk, I welcome interruptions, and it becomes more of a conversation. But in fact, please wait for the end. I'll try to make sure there's time for questions at the end. So this is planning to create a more walkable New Albany, but it's also planning to create a more walkable New Albany, in the sense that, you know, planning is a profession, unlike architecture, which is what I studied, you know, where you're kind of taught to reinvent the wheel every Monday morning. That's what constitutes good architecture these days. Planning is a profession a little bit more like medicine or law, where we try to base our recommendations on things we've learned from past experience. So I thought you might enjoy this picture today. I always start this way, a little bit of a self-introduction, but also to give credit to my mentors, who were Andres, Duany, and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, who founded the New Urbanism movement, really with the design of Seaside 30 years ago, but whose firm I made pilgrimage to 20 years ago to start my career in city planning. And much of what you're going to hear from me today is either something I learned from them or something that I just stole from them, including the images, but they approve. But I'm a city planner, which means I do 2 types of work. I do designs for existing places like South Beach in Miami, where I lived for 10 years working for Andres and Liz. But I also do designs for new places. This happens to be Kentlands. It's outside of Washington, D.C. It's one of our firm's better-known projects. I'm also a card-carrying member of the Congress for the New Urbanism, which I suggest you think about joining and learn more about at cnu.org. But as a new urbanist, quote-unquote, what that means is that we new urbanists study older existing places, the places that people love the most, the places with the most valuable real estate, in order to learn lessons for making these new places. So we count the cars, and we count the trees, and we measure the width of the streets, and we modify as necessary to account for modern habits, but we also acknowledge that it tends to be these places that were designed before the wars in the 20th century, that actually, even now in the 21st century, are the places where people most want to be. So there's tremendous lessons there that allow us to make new places that are better. And by the way, we didn't study South Beach to make Kentlands. We studied Georgetown to make Kentlands, because Kentlands is in Washington, D.C. But not only do we learn the right lessons for making new places from these older places, but also we come to revalue our older places as much of America is coming to do more and more these days. So this is the book that I wrote with Andres and Liz in 2000, and I mention it because it got me appointed to run the design discipline at the National Endowment for the Arts. The chairman had read the book, and that helped me get this job, which allowed me to work for 4 years overseeing this program, the Mayor's Institute on City Design. This was a bit, I learned a ton from Andres and Liz, but this was a bit of an eye-opening experience for me. Essentially, every 2 months, somewhere in America, we would collect, and they still do, I'm not there anymore, 8 mayors 8 designers who I would get to pick, and we'd lock ourselves in a room for 2.5 days. Each mayor would bring their most pressing design challenge. How do I reconnect to my waterfront? Where do I put my convention center? And we would try to solve those problems. In so doing, teaching, hopefully, in the same way that Harvard Business School uses case studies to teach business, these were case studies that were hopefully turning the mayors into better experts on issues of design. But there's kind of a hidden agenda of the program, which is to send the mayors back to their cities as design mayors. And Joe Riley, this guy right here, who founded the program with the NEA 30 years ago, who's in his 10th 4-year term as mayor of Charleston, so that carries some weight with the other mayors. And he would say, Mayor, no one's going to remember if you balance the budget. They're only going to remember if you build a park. And it was a useful experience. So I left the NEA after a 4-year term and went back into private practice on my own, and I started doing a fair amount of work with this group called CEOs for Cities. CEOs for Cities is a nonprofit that cities pay to come in and tell them how to be more competitive. And they brought me in, and they worked with others like me because they realize, and here I'm getting to the point of the theme of my talk, they realize that essentially it's a 2-part deal to make cities more competitive. Half of it is programming. What size convention center do I have, if I have one? What sort of sports facilities do I have? What sort of events, like Art Prize in Grand Rapids, do I have to make my city appealing and successful? But the other half is design, right? What is the design of just these everyday spaces between the buildings, the streets, the squares, the public spaces, that cause people to want to be in them? And I talk about having my eyes opened by the mayors, and then further through this experience, that this whole urban design argument we've been having began to reframe itself around a term that we hadn't been using before, which was walkability. And the mayors were continually pointing towards having a more walkable downtown, both as an indicator of whether the downtown was successful or not, but also, frankly, as a necessary ingredient to being a successful, thriving community. And so it kind of allowed me to reorient my message to, frankly, I think a message which is more easily argued than the neo-traditional message or the new urbanist message or the professional planning message, which is essentially to say, we established this as our goal, and this question is the question around which we center our work. If a vital place is full of pedestrians, then how do you get people to walk? And so my practice literally for, well, let's just say for many years, has been trying to answer this question, and my answer is what I call, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, the general theory of walkability. But as a theory, it's a hypothesis that has been proved to a certain degree through some experimentation. It's constantly evolving. What the general theory of walkability says, and it's in the book. This is the book. I'll tell you more about this in a minute. It says, how do you get people to walk? And I believe the answer is you have to do 4 things simultaneously. And I should say, excuse me, in most of America these days, we're looking for walkers by choice, because most people own cars. For most people, the car is sitting between them and everything that they're about to do. It's in the driveway out the front door. And to get people to walk, then you have to offer a walk which is better, or at least as good as the drive. And for that to be the case, it has to simultaneously, there have to be 4 things satisfied. There has to be a reason to walk, which deals with the proper balance of uses. The walk has to be safe and feel safe. More important than it feels safe for people to make that choice. It has to be comfortable, which is a little bit counterintuitive as I will describe it to you. And it needs to be interesting because we're so easily bored. So I'm going to take you through those 4 categories, which are the structure of my talk today. The reason to walk is the story that Andres Duany calls the story of the planning profession and the great sins of the planning profession. Essentially, the formative victory, before planners were called planners, the formative victory of the planning profession was back in the middle of the 19th century, when the planners realized that they could separate the housing, or should separate the housing, from the dark satanic mills that were making the air so polluted. And lifespans increased immediately, dramatically, and the planners were hailed as heroes and have been trying to repeat that victory ever since. So you have the onset of single-use zoning, what became law in Ohio as Euclidean zoning, and this fact that even though most of us as planners now realize that when you have a recipe of large single-use zones spread across the map, separate from each other, even though we realize that this is a recipe for no walking, still most of the time when I arrive at a place to put a plan on that land, there is already a plan on that land that looks like this. So this idea of single-use zoning where housing is separated from office and office is even separated from medical office, and many codes have like 30 different land uses, and they're not allowed to touch. We know intellectually this is wrong, but the laws are still in the books in most places, and it's so important to understand the difference between, I was an art history major, so this is a Rothko, and this is a Syrah, right, the pointillist. And the more confetti-like the zoning is, and this map of Manhattan is even misleading because everything that you see that's red here is actually vertically mixed use. So not only is each use so small and integrated, but a lot of the mixed use is happening vertically. And clearly the smaller areas you have of single use and the more mixing you have of uses, the more useful the walk becomes, and that's the first step to having a walkable place. So then this is the story that kind of sold me on this whole new urbanist movement when I heard Andres give this talk in 1988 called Town versus Sprawl. And this is the story that became Suburban Nation. And I heard that talk from Andres, I said, oh my God, this is the best story I've ever heard. This has to be a book. And what he said was, and I think it's true, it's a bit of an oversimplification, but there's only two ways to build community in the world that have been tested by the thousands. There's a million ways to make a city, but there's only two things we've done over and over and over again. One is the traditional neighborhood, and the other is suburban sprawl. And the traditional neighborhood is defined by being diverse, with places to live, work, worship, shop, recreate, all within walking distance. It's compact. The traditional, you're looking at several neighborhoods here of Newburyport, Massachusetts. It's compact, typically across cultures and throughout history. It's a 5-minute walk from the edge to the center, almost always. And it's walkable because there's a network of streets so that each street can be quite small. The alternative, suburban sprawl, is defined as being the opposite. Clearly it's not diverse. It's the same land use and often the same house spread over miles and miles of land. It's certainly not compact, thus the name sprawl. And it's not walkable because so few of the streets actually connect anywhere, right? Most streets don't connect, so those few that do connect become so overburdened and so wide and so busy that you wouldn't let your kid out on them. So you have this phenomenon of the cul-de-sac kid, right? The child who's perfectly safe and happy bicycling in the driveway and the cul-de-sac until they reach maybe 8 years old and they get really bored really fast because they rely on their parents to take them everywhere. So it's fun to pick sprawl apart into its constituent parts, the places where you only live, the places where you only work, where you only shop. The supersized public institutions and this tendency you have these days for schools to get bigger and bigger and therefore further and further apart. And the size of the parking lot compared to the size of the school tells you all you need to know about this South Florida school, which is that no child has ever walked to it, no child will ever walk to it. In fact, the housing is so far flung that even busing doesn't work, and it's the seniors and the juniors driving the sophomores and the freshmen, with the death rates to prove it, right? And then even the athletic facilities. Weston, which is west of Fort Lauderdale, is very proud of their 8 soccer fields and 8 baseball diamonds and 8 tennis courts, but not a single mother will let her child on this road, which is why we have soccer moms. Where were the soccer moms when I was a kid? Well, we had 1 baseball diamond and 1 soccer field and 1 basketball court, and they were all walking distance from our homes. So these are all aspects of this new model, which of course is a functional model, but they failed to properly count the cars. So that when you separate everything from everything else, often at great distances, and then only reconnect it with automotive infrastructure, then our interstate highway system, which started out being a system for commerce and for vacations, has become a commuting way. And I lived in 3 different places on the East Coast where I-95 was my way to work. Right? So I always tell people it's a 2-part deal. You can have this, but this comes with this, often to bizarre extremes. And the expense, the sheer expense of this sort of horizontal infrastructure. As our schools and other civic institutions are starved for cash, we build streets like this. The experience of occupying these places, this is not Photoshop, this is outside of Orlando. Walter Kulach took this picture. I could explain it, but that would take the remainder of my hour. And the experience of a drive, of being driving, and often a pedestrian in these places. I love these artists who do this. And then the epidemiologists go around the country showing this slide. Wonderful book, Urban Sprawl and Public Health, that may have this on the cover. The fact that we've engineered a society in which, and I talk about this in my other talk, that we've engineered a society in which driving to park, to take the escalator to the health club where we get on a treadmill to walk, explains why we have the first generation of kids in this country who are expected to live shorter lives than their parents, at least active generation in American history. So these are the 2 models side by side. And this is really a discussion now as you consider expanding your cities or redeveloping parts of your city or building new cities, that you have these 2 models as a choice. And one in which, my point is it's the same stuff, right? You have schools and shops and offices and this could be housing, for example. And then you have the same stuff in a downtown. But it's the fine grain of uses and that network of streets, as opposed to a single arterial, which you have one car engine catching on fire and the whole system shuts down, right? It's actually a much less efficient system for driving, as well as for walking. So that's the big picture of use at the kind of city building scale. But when it comes to looking at existing places and existing neighborhoods, it's a different discussion, which is what is that balance of uses in your downtown? And by the way, I work in big cities, I work in medium-sized cities, I work in small cities, I even work in little villages. And I'm going to keep saying city because that's the word that I'm used to saying, but I'm really talking about any of these walkable places that were built before World War II that have networks of streets and mixed use and the opportunity for this walking, biking, non-auto-dependent lifestyle. And in these places, then, to make them more walkable in this category of the useful walk, you ask yourself, what is the ratio of these different uses, and what use is missing or underrepresented in the downtown? Because the downtown is your greatest hope for having a walkable part of your city. And it's almost always housing. I just did a walkability study for Boise. Their ratio of workplace to residential downtown is 43-1. And that's not unusual in an American city. You have very few people living in your downtown, and almost none living in the heart of your downtown. I would argue, and I will argue, if we talk more, that there is a demand, there's a pent-up demand for people who are going to want to live, especially with the wonderful restaurants and bars and cafes that you now have in the heart of your downtown. There is people who want to live. There are people who want to live there. And by bringing them there, you then all of a sudden have a nighttime population as well as a daytime population. And you have much healthier stores and restaurants. And actually what happens once the housing becomes greater, then these other things, the retail opportunities improve, the recreational opportunities, well, you're done with that. You've got a beautiful, wide downtown. But most places, the parks improve and other things come. And then eventually schools get better. And this is more of a big city discussion, but kind of the hardest nut to crack, as I'm sure you're aware, in our larger cities around America, is the quality of the urban schools. And the story from those cities that have been walkable now for 10, 15, 20 years, like Washington, D.C., is it takes 10, 15, 20 years for the schools to get better. And then they do. But the young people who move there as urban pioneers need to grow up, have kids, and get angry. And eventually you get better schools. Then a separate question, which is might be beginning to be an issue here. Some communities I bring this up, and then I'm told to never bring it up again, and I don't. Parking is often underpriced and overrepresented in your downtown. Most downtowns have too much parking but they look like they have too little parking because the parking is improperly managed, improperly wayfound, I guess you could say, and improperly priced. And thank goodness we have a man named Donald Shoup who wrote this book finally. It came out a few years ago. It's called The High Cost of Free Parking. And Donald Shoup is the dean of American parking. While parking covers more land area than any single land use in all American cities. But until Donald Shoup came along, there was no theory about how to make parking work for the benefit of your city. There's plenty of theory about how many parking spaces you need and how much to provide, and there's plenty of rules about how much parking to provide. But Don Shoup finally has figured out and published in this 723-page, 3.5-page book how to make parking work for the benefit of your city. And I had jury duty, so I read it. And I also with his blessing, turned it into a chapter of my book. So he has this three-legged stool of how parking can work to the benefit of cities. The first is to eliminate the on-site parking requirement and look at parking more collectively. This is Detroit. This was the Opera House in Detroit. The on-site parking requirement does stuff like this. Often the requirements are arbitrary, don't bear too much relation to what the needs really are. But more importantly, by allowing and by insisting that drivers are parking at immediately in front of or at or in their destinations, it eliminates street life because there's no reason to walk around. It also tends to create buildings that pull back from the sidewalk and streetscape of parking lots. And that by providing parking collectively in a centralized location, you actually create a pedestrian anchor. And rather than asking developers to pay for parking when they build something, you ask them to pay money into a fund to create a municipal parking system. It's much more complicated than that, but it's that's the gist of it. The second thing, and this is probably the toughest nut to crack, is to price parking in a way that responds to demand. I guess you could call it congestion pricing, demand-based pricing. This is one of the first parking plans ever done, modern era parking plans done. This was done for Redwood City, California. But what you see from red to orange to yellow is the fact that we're pricing the parking with a goal in mind. And that goal is one empty space per block face at all times. Daddy Warbucks should be able to find a place near the Furrier. And what happens in a lot of cities is in your prime location, on your Pearl Street or wherever it might be, at the key hours when people with money want to spend that money, they need to be able to find the parking spaces. And there need to be other spaces available at a slight distance, which you have, which are cheaper or maybe free. But if you have crowding, and only if you have crowding, you need to raise the price of parking. I've worked in cities where by following this rule, we actually reduced the price of parking because there wasn't enough crowding, right? But you want the price that responds to the market so that you don't have shop owners parking in front of their own stores and taking away their customer base, or employees parking in front of the stores. And you may reach a point, if you're not there yet, as your downtown continues to blossom, you're probably going to reach a point where you're going to want to start charging for parking. But do I have to leave now? Now, the third leg of the stool, interestingly, is, in a sense, a function of the problem, which is that merchants almost always fight the right price for parking. And in fact, they forget that the history of the parking meter was invented by merchants, for merchants, to create the churn, to create the turnover, to get the wealthy customers shopping inside the shops. But the merchants almost always fight it. And so what they did, for example, in Pasadena, to convince them to accept the higher rate, was says your meter money makes a difference. Safety, streets, cleanliness, alleys. Every extra dollar that they earn in Pasadena by their higher priced parking goes into the streetscape. They turn the meter alleys into a beautiful collection of courtyards, the storefronts, the trees. It's this virtuous cycle where now it's gotten more beautiful and more beautiful. People want to come there more. They're paying even more to park there, and it just gets better and better and better. And Don Shoup illustrates in his book any number of cases where the very same merchants who fought the right pricing of parking, when they lost, if they lost, The very next day, they said to the folks who beat them, "Thank you for beating me. My store is doing twice as well now." So it's a tough discussion, and one that you may not have to have yet, but it's just worth keeping in the loop. So then there's one other discussion, which is what is valuable and being wasted, and that could also be parking in the sense of parking structures. And I see that you have one. A number of cities, the most recent one I visited was Hamilton, Ohio, but this is Lowell, Massachusetts, where I did a downtown plan. A number of cities are trying to get more housing downtown. Most are. They find that housing is prohibitively expensive. In Lowell, Massachusetts, they had millions of square feet of early industrial lofts that they were trying to put housing into, and the developers were having trouble bringing it in at an affordable cost because the banks require the developers to provide 1 or 2 parking spaces per unit. Do we have to build those parking spaces? And the city said, oh, well, we have 5 parking structures downtown. We're going to write letters for you developers that you can bring to your banks that tell you that you can use our parking structures overnight to satisfy your parking requirement. And in fact, these parking structures had a little bit of daytime empty spaces and a lot of overnight empty spaces. And by attaching these structures to the loft buildings, they were successful in bringing the lofts in at a reasonable price. And so, you've got at least one parking deck downtown. I don't know who owns it or how it's managed. It really doesn't matter who owns it. Who does own it? The city. So the city has the opportunity in a much more direct way than is sometimes the case when the city doesn't own it, to perhaps attach these spaces, which seem to be empty today, but are certainly empty at night, to new residential development downtown. That's it. So that's the reason to walk. The biggest category is the safe walk, which most walkability advocates, it's all they talk about. For me, it's one of many things that are alone necessary but not sufficient to get people to walk. But it's absolutely the case that people won't make the choice to walk if they don't feel they have a fighting chance against being hit by automobiles. And there are about 100 different things that add up to people feeling safe or unsafe in the streetscape. The first one of them is block size. The size of the blocks. This is Portland, Oregon, famously walkable, famously 200-foot blocks. Right here's the 200-foot scale. This is Salt Lake City, from the same height, famously unwalkable, famously 600-foot blocks. It's almost like 2 different planets, right? You can fit 9 Portland blocks in a Salt Lake City block. And the difference is that a 200-foot block city is basically a 2-lane city, whereas a 600-foot block city is about a 6-lane city. Then when you have the same amount of development, you need a lot wider streets in such a fat block network, and then each street becomes much less walkable. Here's the statistics, a study done in California, 24 different cities, more safe and less safe in terms of injuries and deaths. As you double the average block size, you almost quadruple the number of fatal crashes not on highways. So there's a clear correlation there. Smaller blocks are safer. Here's your block network, at least in the heart of your downtown. You're doing pretty well. Your typical block is about 300 by 400, which, as American cities go, is not bad at all. Here you are compared to Portland. Obviously, you're less densely developed than Portland. That's not an issue in this discussion. And the main message here, you're stuck with your block system, but you've got good bones. So that's very promising because you're a pre-war, essentially, city. But the main message here probably is just to not do what a lot of cities have done, which is to super block, to consolidate blocks in the name of making a hospital more efficient or a university campus more connected, or sometimes in the name of walkability, people remove streets from the network and make them strictly pedestrian streets, which can work in very dense cities like Chicago or New York. But in smaller cities, typically any street you remove from the grid is then taking traffic and pushing it onto the other streets in the way that they become less walkable. So you really want to maintain your existing street network. The next point, which is what I talk about in every city without fail, is the concept of induced demand. Induced demand is the great black hole in traffic planning. And for you, with the changes that are coming regarding your bridge, it's very important that we have this discussion very loudly. So induced demand refers to highways, but it also refers to just everyday city streets. And what induced demand says is that this is how traffic engineering and traffic planning has worked for so many years, with this idea that you anticipate a greater number of trips on a street, and in order to absorb those trips, you widen the street, and you're done. But of course, theory doesn't always match up with reality, and this is what happens in reality, which is that the widening of the street induces more trips. I could spend an hour talking to you about that because it's absolutely fascinating. The simple way to discuss it is to say that in congested systems, and only in congested systems, but in congested systems, the principal constraint to driving is congestion, right? So if you eliminate that constraint, people make the decision to drive more. And so it happens again and again. And the question isn't whether you're going to have congestion or not. It's how many lanes of congestion do you want? And what is the nature of the downtown that you want to have? So this is supposedly well known. I ripped this out of Newsweek magazine with a yelp of glee. It says, today's engineers acknowledge that building new roads usually makes traffic worse. To which I responded, well, may I please meet some of those engineers? Because most places I go, even though the engineers actually, they say that they understand induced demand, but they make decisions every day that shows that they don't really believe it. They say the traffic's coming, we need to add that extra lane, and then the traffic comes and they say, see, I told you it would come, right? But it's the lane that made the traffic possible. And this is the study. It was presented to the Paris School of Economics, the fundamental law of highway congestion. I have no idea what this means. But the conclusion essentially says that as you increase capacity, the amount of traffic, the ratio of the increased traffic over the increased capacity pretty quickly hits 1. Within 4 years, all that capacity is typically used up. Metro areas that invested heavily in road capacity expansion fared no better in easing congestion than metro areas that did not. Trends in congestion show that areas that exhibited greater growth in lane capacity spent roughly $22 billion more on road construction than those that didn't, yet ended up with slightly higher congestion costs per person, wasted fuel, and travel delay. And this is the conversation that they've forgotten to have in Louisville, which, in one of my tweets the other day, I said I'm never going to go to Louisville because they're widening their highway again. But people just like to spend federal money, and at the federal level, they don't talk about induced demand properly. So that's all well and good, and I like to have the induced demand discussion everywhere I go, and then I stop talking about it because I still can't win. And there's great gains to be had without having the induced demand discussion. So let's talk about that. This is Oklahoma City, which is kind of typical in American cities that have developed more recently. And Oklahoma City, the mayor, who I now know quite well, who I knew pretty well from the Mayor's Institute session, called me up because Oklahoma City was named by Prevention Magazine as the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country, which couldn't be true, but that's what they said. So he said, help us, we need to fix this problem. And we did one of my first walkability studies. And first we looked at the block structure and said, well, this is Portland, this is Oklahoma City. Nice, pretty small blocks. So if you've got Portland-sized blocks, why do you have Salt Lake City-sized streets? And in fact, they told me, we had our very own Robert Moses, who was the Public Works Commissioner. Widen it first, ask questions later. And in fact, if you were a city council member and you didn't accept his widenings in your district, you wouldn't get your trash collected in your district. So it was a pretty powerful phenomenon. And they have all these streets that are essentially oversized. So you look at the traffic counts, zooming into the downtown. This is the downtown grid. 11,000 cars per day, 9,000, 4,000, 3,000, 3,000, 5,000. And we know that 2 lanes can handle 10,000 cars per day. Yet, these were the streets in the brand new downtown plan that were designated to be rebuilt at 4 to 6 lanes. And look at the car counts on them. Hudson Avenue, 6 lanes at 8,000 cars per day. So, we were lucky. Right after I did the walkability study, Devon Energy was building a new 50-story tower in the heart of downtown, generating close to $200 million in additional tax increment They said, what do we spend this tax increment on? Let's spend it on making the downtown more walkable and fixing that street system. And so they launched Project 180, which turned out to be about the price. It's 180 acres, but it turned out to be $176 million. And my job was to redesign essentially the curb-to-curb of every street in the downtown. And so in right-sizing the streets to correspond with the amount of traffic that they were currently holding or were anticipated to hold, we ended up with all this extra pavement. So what did we do with it? We doubled the amount of on-street parking. According to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, every on-street parking space is worth $10,000 to a shop nearby per year. I should say that statistic is 15 years old. And we took a non-existent bicycling network and created a comprehensive bicycling network because we had all this extra pavement. Now, of course, sometimes I forget to mention this, that when we made these proposals, and my client was the Public Works Department, they handed it to their traffic engineering consultant firm, who ran the synchro model and came back and said, gridlock. I said, how could this possibly be gridlock? And I handed it to my engineers, who reran the synchro model and fixed the inputs, which were all wrong, but anticipated background growth that wasn't going to happen, and all this stuff that was just false. And we put in a couple left-hand turn lanes and we were done. And even during the construction, there's been no traffic backups downtown. So a typical street going from a 4-laner to nowhere to a 2-laner, now under construction, and it's about half done. Another street, this is a major arterial and had to stay at 4 lanes with a turn lane, but we were able to put in a median, narrow the lanes to the proper width, and now we have bike lanes as well in this street. It's a little hard to see, but there's a bike lane next to the parked cars. And so the first thing to ask yourself here, and I believe this is State Street, which unfortunately is a state highway, and of course when you add state highway to the name of a street, you add 5 years and $50,000 to the cost of fixing it for the city. But you only have so many state highways in your downtown, and there's plenty of streets that can be fixed that aren't state highways. This is State Street that's a state highway, and you see the number of lanes here, and the fact that there was probably once parallel parking on this curb, and now there isn't because it's a 3-laner as opposed to a 2-laner. And I don't know enough about the car counts to say that this is a street that should lose a lane, but there are certainly streets downtown, I'm confident, that have more lanes than they have volume, and then you have the opportunity to put those lanes to other uses. Now, one-way streets. I've noticed you have some one-way streets here. One-way streets are bad for pedestrians for a number of reasons. Certainly in terms of how drivers behave on them, that's probably the most important thing. You know, when you're a driver on a one-way street, there's no opposing traffic to slow you down. Probably more importantly, there's always another lane. And I'm not talking about the one-lane one-ways of Portland or Manhattan. I'm talking about these multi-lane one-way streets that were once two-way streets, that were reverted to one-way in the great national one-way epidemic of the 60s and 70s, right? And because there's always another lane, as a driver, you enter a fundamentally different mindset, which is that of kind of jockeyer and road racer. And you know, whatever lane you're in, the other lane is faster, and you want to be in it, right? But you stop looking for pedestrians, you stop looking at stores, you stop, you know, rather than waiting behind the bumper of the car in front of you and looking around and enjoying yourself, you're looking for the faster way through. And that's the most important aspect of why people speed on these streets. For pedestrians, just the sheer inertial mass or momentum of all these cars going the same direction can be very threatening. And they're bad for stores because they distribute energy unevenly. So, for example, in Miami, when they took the pair of streets that ran through Little Havana in the 1970s and reverted them to one-way, the path to work was the main street, Cayocho, in Little Havana, was the path to work. The path home from work was on a residential street. Well, who shops on the way to work? Nobody. And Cayocho died because of that uneven distribution. So the best story, and probably the best news article for convincing some of the merchants who might not support it, is what happened in Vancouver, Washington, where they had this main street that was one way, and they tried every trick to improve this moribund main street that wasn't doing very well. You know, and all the all the quick fixes of the 80s, the bricks, the banners, the berms, the bandstands, the ballers, the balloons, right? And nothing did it until finally they reverted it to two-way traffic. And what this article in Governing Magazine says is that the shops immediately got twice the revenue that they had before. And the head of the Merchants Association just says you should never have a one-way street in a commercial area. Now that's not true. There are exceptions to every rule. But if you have a street that could be doing better and it's one way, then chances are it's a good idea to make it two-way. Here's Cedar Rapids, typical place where I work, and reminds me to tell you, most places I work don't have the money of an Oklahoma City. And what they have to do is spend the money on, is spend what little money they have, not on rebuilding, but on restriping. And most cities I go to are about to spend $3 million doing something, fixing one street. And I'm like, don't rebuild one street, restripe your whole downtown core. You can do it for less money. And in Cedar Rapids, Cedar Rapids is this beautiful little downtown that's all 4-lane and half one way. And the blocks are small and the car counts are small. And so we're doing a plan, a little hard to see. We're turning this all 4-lane, half one-way system to an all 2-lane, all 2-way system. And that allows us to add 60% more on-street parking and to essentially double the bicycle facilities, because there's just room in the pavement for it. Interestingly, it also allows us to eliminate 11 out of 15 of the signals in the downtown and replace them with 4-way stop signs. And by the way, the 4-way stop is the poor man's roundabout. And it's the new roundabout. It's better for pedestrians than roundabouts. Lots of eye contact. The car is stopping at every intersection. It's wonderful for bicyclists because, you know, you just blow through it if you're a biker. And I do. And the cars actually will get through the downtown quicker because they're never waiting at a light. They're driving slow the whole time and stopping 4 or 5 times, and then moving again immediately. So it's better for everybody, and it saves them. You know, each stop signal costs $150,000. So we're actually making money by fixing this downtown. And the engineers just approved this plan last month. So you've got this one-way system. A little hard for you to see, maybe. There are lots of one-way arrows in this grid, and you know, some of them. You know, is the ideal to revert the whole thing to two-way? Maybe. Is the ideal necessary? Probably not. And it depends on what the street is, you know, what the right solution is. You know, here's a street which is 3 lanes in one direction, which makes it, is this Spring? Spring. It makes, you know, 3 lanes in one direction makes it very easy to revert to a two-way system because you can have that center turn lane when you want it. You know, 2 lanes in one direction, like, is this Pearl? Yeah. Which is so beautiful. If Pearl were handling a ton of traffic, it would be a problem to revert Pearl, but Pearl's handling very little traffic. So Pearl's probably a very easy reversion to do. And then you have the most bizarre street I've ever been in my life, which is Market. Which is just funny because it's clear that you had a wonderful median 2-way street that when they, you know, this is a, you know, what you see here is the legacy of turning a 2-way median street into 1-way. And so you have to pick, am I a lefty or a righty? You know, which side am I driving down? And there's clearly room in Market to make it a 2-way street. So obviously these opportunities are there. But it's a beautiful street, and it frankly works okay the way it is. I do think the principal, on a street like this, the principal motivation probably is to see the stores do better, not to make it just more walkable. And then we can talk about this another time. Okay, so that's the number of lanes and the direction of the lanes. What about the width of the lanes? The standards have changed in America. This is the problem. The typical street to the typical subdivision in America is wide enough to allow you to see the curvature of the earth, right? Because of these new standards. This is how it used to be. This is a subdivision from the 60s. Look at the width of the street. And this is from the 80s. Same height, right? The street's just doubled in width. And the standards have changed to the point where my old neighborhood in South Beach, when the street wasn't draining properly, they had to fix the curb. But they had to fix the curb to the new standard. So we lost half our sidewalk and our street trees because of this ridiculous new standard when the street had been working perfectly well before. The wider the lane is, the faster people drive. You know, a 10-foot lane is a 30, 35 mile an hour lane. A standard, that's the American standard for main streets. A 12-foot lane, which has become the standard in many cities, is a highway width lane. It's a 70 mile an hour lane. Why do cities like Omaha, Nebraska, where I just was, insist on highway speed lanes in their downtown? It makes no sense unless you want people to speed. Increased lane widths are responsible for approximately 900 additional traffic fatalities per year, according to this one study. The traffic engineers for years have rejected this thinking, but now they're beginning to support it. Width of streets narrowed by popular demand in Birmingham, Michigan. Residents know this. Advanced cities like Portland have skinny streets programs, and this is when we talk about some of the streets that are handling very low amounts of traffic, and how actually a 12-foot travel lane with parking on one side or two sides can handle traffic in two directions. This is the kind of street that many of us grew up on, right? When a car's coming at you, you just kind of pull over into the parking lane and let it go by. This is the kind of street you want your kids to live on. And it's illegal in most places, even though it's in the engineer's green book, page 436, bless you, of the AASHTO manual. It's in there. So this is the kind of street that cities are bringing back for their low-speed streets. So in this new town that we built outside of Charleston, Vince Graham is the developer. He shows these slides at conferences with his wonderful 22-foot two-way streets with parking on one side. And he quotes this famous philosopher who said, "Broad is the road that leads to destruction. Narrow is the road that leads to life." And this plays very well in the South. So ITE has approved. ITE came out with this manual that's a recommended practice of the Institute of Traffic Engineers for downtowns now, for heavily trafficked streets, 10 to 11-foot travel lanes and 8-foot parking lanes. It's there, and it was just approved by the Federal Highway Administration. So there's no reason to go wider than 11 anywhere. And really 11 is if you have buses and other big vehicles on it, and 10 is the standard. So here's a street. I believe it's heading east on Market. That's already being, I didn't know this when I prepared my talk, but I learned from John that they're already rebuilding this street, because look at this, you've essentially got, this is Main, excuse me, east on Main. You've essentially got an extra 6 feet in there that you don't need, just extra wide lanes. And then this, I'm not sure where, this is that street. And you can see the great distance between the cars and the parked cars, which would allow for a bike lane or some other restriping to happen there. Then there's bikes. You guys need to have, with my help perhaps, we need to have the political discussion about bikes. There's no doubt that people who chose to come to this event, who are sitting in this room, probably want to see more biking in your town. But the perception here, as in most places I go, is that that's a battle that is by no means won at this point. The greatest revolution currently underway in city planning in only some American cities is biking. And dramatic increases in biking in those cities that choose to invest in bicycling infrastructure. This is Portland, Oregon. Portland, Oregon, back in the 70s, they didn't bike any more than any other city, any other similar city. They invested $60 million in bike facilities, which sounds like a lot of money. It was half the price of the one Cloverleaf they rebuilt. Okay? They invested $60 million over 30 years, and now Portlanders bike 15 times as much as the rest of the country. And I asked my friend Tom Brennan of Nelson Nygaard for pictures of the Portland commute, and he sent me these pictures. I said, well, what was this, bike to work day? He said, no, it was Tuesday. Right? This is Tuesday in Portland, every day in Portland. New York City has doubled the amount of biking multiple times by painting these bright green lanes. More automotive cities like Long Beach, California. It is one of those rare build it and they will come conditions. If someone said to me this morning, oh, we don't have a biking population in New Albany, I said, yeah, you don't have biking facilities to speak of in New Albany. Biking population is a function of biking facilities, plain and simple. And by the way, in New York City and other places, as the number of bicyclists doubles and doubles again, the number of injuries stays flat. Because Once cars get used to seeing bikers, the bikers are safe. Chicago introducing this now, the gold standard, the buffered bike lane. You pull the parking off the curb into what used to be a travel lane. You create this 11-foot zone of a two-way bike lane and a 3-foot buffer. This person's going the wrong way because this is the day they were like parading on the bike lane. But that's the gold standard. And then if like Pasadena, which gets some things wrong, if every lane is a bike lane, then no lane is a bike lane, which is why this is the only cyclist I met in Pasadena. So you've introduced bike lanes to Spring Street. This is a first for me, and John, don't take this the wrong way. This is pretty funny that you've got two bike lanes going the same direction on two sides of the street. But when you have too much pavement, it is a smart thing to do. But you know, the gold-plated version of this, which by the way doesn't cost much more, would be to do a buffered bike lane, to pull the parking off the curb and have a two-way bike lane between the parking and the moving vehicles. It's so important. I had argued for years that you couldn't have successful sidewalk dining without parallel parking, and then 2 years ago I went to Fort Lauderdale and found this street, which at happy hour, also known as rush hour, you're allowed to park on the inbound side of the street, but you're not allowed to park on the outbound side of the street. So this is happy hour on the park side of the street, and this is happy hour on the unparked side of the street. And that restaurant has gone out of business since I took this picture. Very important. And then of course you have streets, again, that have lost their parallel parking in order to provide better flow, and that's a devil's bargain. And then the other part of this slide is the street trees. The street trees are wonderful for so many reasons. They make pedestrians much happier, much more comfortable, and we recently learned from some important studies that they slow cars down. Sometimes abruptly, but cars go slower when there are vertical objects like trees by the roadside, and of course also they protect a buffer, that they provide a buffer that protects pedestrians from vehicles. Then there's all the little details. You know, what is the radius of curvature of the corner? Is it 1 foot or is it 40 feet? Because that's going to determine how fast the car goes around the corner and how much pavement you have to cross. Anything swoopy says this is a place for cars, but not a place for people. So I had to chuckle at this image. It's, I guess objective journalism says, some say the entrance to City Center is not inviting to pedestrians. Oh, really? And this is from, this is the expansion to the Strip in Las Vegas that's done so badly. Because when every aspect of the streetscape kind of communicates automotive motion, then pedestrians aren't comfortable. So you have the swoops, anything stream-form geometrics, anything aerodynamic looking is going to make pedestrians feel less comfortable than they could. Which brings me to these funny X's. Are these still here?
Yes.
So is this a state highway?
No, that's Pearl Street.
Okay, this is. I've only seen these once before, and that was in Amityville, New York, which was a state highway. Which I guess these exist so that cars can swoop in and out without having to actually stop and back up to park? Or are they loading zones? What are they?
They're loading zones.
Okay, they're loading zones. Well, in New York City, they're on a state highway to free the flow of traffic, and of course, it's not so good for pedestrians. And then all the little details. This slide, which Andre Duany's been showing for years, is really about how we can't let the specialists design our city. That someone has to be looking at the big picture. Yes, this street will drain and be bone dry within 30 seconds of the 100-year flood, but this woman has to mount this curb, every day. So that's the biggest category, and now very quickly I'm going to run through the final two categories. It's much quicker. The comfortable walk and the interesting walk. The comfortable walk has to do with spatial perception and the fact that we like to feel enclosed. All animals seek prospect and refuge. It's in our DNA from millennia of survival that we feel most comfortable when our flanks are covered, and we feel uncomfortable in our bones when we don't have those street walls turning our outdoor spaces into outdoor living rooms. And so we've been talking about this as planners for many years. The Renaissance ideal space is 1-to-1, 1-to-3, or 3-to-1 can be good. 6-to-1, you start to lose your sense of spatial definition. So the height to width ratio is very important. But most important is the presence of buildings up against the sidewalk edge. 6 to 1 can be absolutely lovely in a climate as north as Salzburg, which, by the way, is north of New York. In the opposite of Salzburg is Houston. And the message here being, of course, it is the surface parking lot that is the prime enemy to that feeling of enclosure as you walk down the street. And I'm kind of curious, I know this parking lot gets a lot of use. You guys are doing pretty well in that regard, but there are a few places where it'd be nice to have some better edges, particularly as we want to see more connectivity between your riverfront and these north-south streets. It'd be great to see something here on this site. But this site, I think, is a great opportunity for a taller building that would have views over the river and be valuable for that reason. Maybe put the parking underneath it because it's so desired that the parking can afford to be underground. And then finally, the interesting walk has to do with the fact that we're all, humans are among the social primates. Nothing interests us more than other humans. Spatial ratios are all well and good, but this is a perfect one-to-one ratio. This is the street that connects the two best hotels in Grand Rapids. And Grand Rapids is a pretty walkable city, but no one walks on this street because when one side of the street is an exposed parking garage and the other side is a conference facility that was apparently designed in admiration of that exposed parking garage. And it's just boring. Joe Riley in Charleston taught us many years ago that it only takes 25 feet of building to hide 250 feet of parking deck. And there's all sorts of different tricks and ways to do this. This is what I call the Chia Pet garage in South Beach. But this garage really brought its neighborhood back to life. And then this is a project I love to show as kind of a last example of the useful and the interesting walk. And it's in Columbus, Ohio. And to the left is the convention center and the sports arena and a very busy part of downtown. And to the right is the Short North neighborhood, which is ethnic, was struggling. Great restaurants, great little shops, was doing very badly until it came time to rebuild this bridge that no one was crossing. All these conventioneers and sports fans, no one was crossing over the depressed highway to get to the Short North. And so the city paid the state $1.9 million to build a bridge that was slightly wider, and they gave the widened parts of the bridge to a developer who built this. And now people are walking back and forth across that bridge as if it was just a piece of the city. And in fact, if you read the newspaper articles, not the planning magazine articles, the newspaper articles say this bridge has brought the Short North back to life, and it's now the hottest neighborhood in Columbus. So a very small investment producing a great outcome. So that's it. And there's more I can tell you about how to bring this theory to cities, but I'm actually going to stop because I want to leave time for questions. This is a plan I did for Fort Lauderdale. So this is the book. I hope you will read it. It's called Walkable City. And if you're a real junkie, the other books are Suburban Nation and the Smart Growth Manual. Mostly I want to say I'm on Twitter, and because I'm on Twitter, I judge my self-worth by the number of followers I have. So I hope you will follow me at Jeff Speck AICP. But thank you so much for your attention, and we do have time, at least I have time, for some questions. Thank you. So, who's first? Yes, sir. As the first person to read the book, you get the first question.
What I was going to ask is, so what we see a lot around here, and I'm sure it's not just here, it's other places too, is that the people who are in a position to do something about this seem to fear that there is some variety of backlash or some variety of opposition to it. And I look around the room, of course, probably everybody who came today, was already sort of predisposed to at least understand the topic. So I guess my question would be, so what is actually the nature of that opposition?
They don't talk to me, so I don't know. I'm joking. The problem is, and You know, I really don't feel that what I'm doing when I go to cities is all that more advanced than what all my colleagues and we've been doing for many years is. But the way that I've learned just recently to do this is to identify areas of excess supply. Oh, thank you. The opposition is people who feel that they will be slowed drivers who worry that their commute will be made longer to a noticeable degree. And for many years, we planners have said either, oh no, due to induced demand, you don't have to worry about it, because the opposite is also true. As you reduce capacity, you reduce demand, and it, you know, there are plenty of examples of that being the case. Or they have said, look, we demand equal rights as pedestrians and cyclists, and it's wrong that the automobile has ruled the landscape for so many decades, and now it's time for us to get our fair share, right? Both of those arguments are losing arguments, because no one believes the induced demand argument, even though it's been proved 3 ways since Friday, whatever the expression is. And, you know, your rights versus my rights is never a winning argument. So what I do when I come to cities is I say, I'm not going to fight those battles. I'm not going to take away one bit. I'm not going to reduce capacity one bit below what the demand is currently. And by the way, vehicle miles traveled in America peaked in almost every city around 2008, 2009. It's been going down ever since. So this idea that we have to plan for more driving, well, first of all, we know that it invites more driving to plan for more driving. This idea that car trips are going to keep increasing seems to be a false one. So you identify the current demand by doing car counts, and then you identify the current supply by doing lane counts. And you see, as I suggested in Oklahoma City, you find where the mismatch is. And particularly, you find the places where that mismatch aligns with streets where people are likely to walk because they're nice anyway. And you know, I have the hierarchy of useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting. And fixing the street fixes the safe. But it's only worth doing that, or I should say, it's most effective to do that first, only in those places that are useful, comfortable, and interesting. Because that's where walking is prone to happen. Now, there's exceptions to that rule. One is you want to make sure you connect key anchors, like theaters and parking lots, and you want to pay a lot of attention to equity, where the bus station is, and where the folks who can't drive are going to be landing in your city, because they don't have a choice. But with those caveats, anchors and paths, and equity, you look at where improvements to street safety are likely to generate increased walking, because then you can deliver the whole package of useful, safe, useful, comfortable, interesting, and safe, which is what you, as a city, can fix very quickly by restriping streets. But by framing that discussion in an understanding and an acceptance that I wouldn't ask you to reduce capacity at all below current traffic levels, that makes it a much more viable political discussion. Long answer to a good question. Yes, in the back.
I enjoyed seeing Lowell and Newburyport. My mom owned a condo in one of those buildings you showed. So that was fun. But you talked about 10 to 15 years of the neighborhood being concentrated on improving schools. I'm curious, do you know of any examples of a school that's fabulous creating a neighborhood? Because we have really fabulous schools and some really fabulous land, but they're still drop off and go. You know, they're still, so could the reverse, you see the reverse happening, and do you have any examples of that?
Not so much, because the pioneers are generally not families. Right? The pioneers tend to be millennials, artists, gays, and recent graduates who actually not only aren't scared, but their self-image means it's cooler for them to live in the city. Right? And in fact, you want to make sure, we've seen this mistake made before. We're in Trenton, New Jersey. We advocated for building some housing, some apartments in downtown Trenton, and a developer said, oh, I've tried that, it didn't work. So okay, take us to what you did. And it was like garden apartments with lace curtains for dentists from New Jersey. Ignoring the fact that that wasn't the market at all. The market was going to be young people who envision themselves as pioneers. And frankly, if you've got wood paneling in the elevator, rip it out and leave the glue. Right? That's the look you want for these people. And I talk about this in my other talk. Today's millennials, unlike my generation, which was raised on the Partridge Family, Brady Bunch, Happy Days, the millennials, who are the current generation of urban pioneers, were raised on Friends and Seinfeld and Sex and the City, and their self-image is based on wanting to have that experience, and that's why the pioneers are typically millennials. And then, Joe, who comes after the millennials? Is their parents, the front-end boomers, who want to be able to retire to a place where they don't have to leave it when they stop driving. So that's the second huge chunk. But they won't come until the millennials have made it safe. Right? And then the families are third, because the families arrive when the millennials don't leave. Or, in my case, when the Gen Xers in the more walkable cities have stuck around and started to have kids. But it's funny, we were in our playground the other day, our neighborhood playground, and a woman from the Washington Post came up. She said, "Yeah, I'm writing an article on people having kids in their 30s in the district, and let's talk about that." And there was not a single person. People in their 20s having kids in the district. We said, "You can go ahead and interview it was a birthday party. You can go ahead and interview the 50 parents in this playground. Not a single one of them is under 30 years old." Right? So it's interesting. The young people move there. They enjoy the urban lifestyle for as long as they can before reproducing. And then they demand that the city change around them, and the city does change, but it's a longer proposition. Sir?
I want to thank you. I didn't expect to hear words like this, and you really brought me to tears. I didn't think I'd hear them in this city. But I have a simple question. Will you sign our books?
Oh, yeah, if you have a book, I'd be happy to sign it. I actually realize I'm being whisked off momentarily, so I'll take one more question, and then I will. Anyone who has a book, I'd be delighted to sign your book. Thank you for having the book. Sir?
You haven't talked about the suburbs and trying to make it more walkable. I just wondered if that's hopeless or...
Well, I hate to leave on a sour note. There's a wonderful book called Retrofitting Suburbia that has plenty of examples of office parks and shopping malls that have been turned and are being turned into mixed-use neighborhood centers that at least make life better for the suburbanites around them who typically drive to them. They can park once and enjoy urban experiences, and also there are places to live in these places. There's another book called The Sprawl Repair Manual by my colleague Galina Tacheva, who also works at Duany Plater-Zyberk, that has that stuff in it, but it has a whole chapter on retrofits to suburban subdivisions, which is complete fantasy because of homeowners associations and the fact that you try to bring a little corner store to an all-residential subdivision, or you try and take a cul-de-sac and connect it through, you'll be chased out of town with pitchforks. So in fact, there's very little hope for changing the residential, like the stuff I showed, the thousands of houses all piled on top of each other. Very little hope for changing those places, but there's a tremendous amount of hope for changing the commercial places to have more housing in them. And this is why I focus on downtowns, because the downtowns already have the commercial. It's very easy for them to acquire residents. The only issue is cost. It's not demand, and there's very few neighbors fighting it. The neighbors want it, right? The shops want it. Everyone wants it. But doing the opposite is almost impossible. Thank you so much for your... all right,
just one more.
Yes. Okay.
Just one more. It's like the theory of when you go to a concert and you want to hear your favorite song. What are traffic studies?
I'm not going to say it publicly, sorry. You have to read the book. It begins with bull. So thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it.